Okay, perfect. So this week's chapter is, I think it's a really interesting one because it's all about self-identity and the development of self-identity and identity formation. Um, and what's kind of interesting about this chapter, I think, is that it's one of those that is kind of almost harder to define. It's a little bit more philosophical, meaning that it can be unique to each person and take on a couple of different interpretations. Like I like to start all my lectures, just so you know, this is not a complete overview of the reading. This is me just picking out key areas that I think are important for you to definitely know and for us to have a small discussion about. But do please make sure that you are completing all of your readings and not just relying on these lecture videos, because they definitely don't go into depth with all the material in the book. So to start off, I wanted to talk a little bit about temperament versus personality. So temperament is a person's innate characteristic, behavioral style, or typical pattern of responding to events in the environment. So usually when we think about temperament, a lot of times, especially in development, we automatically go to thinking about babies, infants, newborns, whatever you may call it, and there are different styles of temperament. And not just meaning, how they directly react to the environment around them. So are they easily fussy, or are they a very agreeable baby? And if you've ever worked with children before, you know that certain babies just are fussy babies, and that has to do with their temperament. And the book really goes into this interesting section about twins. Twins who maybe are identical or fraternal, are they going to have the same temperament, especially um, identical twins? Are they going to have the same sort of temperament growing up, or is it going to be different? And that's a really interesting part to not only read, but for you to ponder on and think about. So aside from that, we have personality. And your personality is a unique system of identifiable characteristics, behavioral patterns that distinguish one person from another. So this is one, I think we all have a good idea what personality is. We all have a personality. But think about when we're talking about personality, what makes you unique or different from others? How would you describe your ability to work with others? Is a great way to think about your personality, or how do others think about you, and what are some of your strong attributes and maybe things that you don't have strengths in. I think these are all areas that fit into personality, though the idea of personality can be a little bit vague. And the interesting part is, when going through this chapter, it's kind of talking how we start with our temperament and we develop a personality from that temperament, based on our interaction with our environment. But there are researchers that also argue that environment and socialization can only influence temperament within the limits of heredity, meaning that a lot of this is part of our code, our DNA of who we are, our hereditary components. So when thinking about that, maybe go back to the whole nature and nurture argument and think about where that falls. So moving on, I wanted to talk about the self. So self-concept. Now this is a little bit more complicated. It is the perception of oneself as a personal identifiable behaviors and characteristics. So this gets a little bit more complicated than just personality. This is how we perceive ourselves in a larger context. So this is often directed by desires, preferences, attributes, and abilities. And just use yourself as an example. How do you perceive yourself? What has influenced this perception? That's one of the biggest components of this, because we might have our innate characteristics, and we might have our temperament and our personality, but our environment's going to have a very large impact on how we perceive ourselves, how we think about ourselves. So think about your developmental niche, which we already have covered, and very much your bioecological systems. So thinking about who's closest to you, where do you grow up, what are the expectations for where you grow up. Did you grow up in an individualistic or collectivistic society? Because this is going to set ideas that's more focused and different, either the individual or as a group, and it's going to really impact what an individual might believe of themselves. So in the book, it goes into some examples from Japan, China, and India, and I think those are definitely ones that you should check out and read. I would give you a page number, but honestly, I have a later edition book than you all. It's just like the one edition before, but I didn't want to give you the wrong page number. So it's in chapter 6, so just go check it out. So along with all of that, we have to talk about a child's goodness of fit. So this means the quality of the adaptation or match between a child's temperament and the demands of his immediate environment. So this goes along with what we were just talking about before, the self-concept. So you can see these thoughts and ideas are getting kind of more complicated. So this means how well does this child fit into the environment that they are growing up in. This takes into both consideration the nature and the nurture, because we have our own innate temperament or characteristics, but how well is the environment that we're growing up in helping to promote our own healthy identity and a healthy development. So it goes into Thomas and Chess's study in the book. I would definitely read that as well, talking about the easy child, the difficult child, and the slow to warm up child. It's a very interesting study that they were studying several different babies and their temperaments and how that fit in with the environment they were growing up in. And I think it's really, this is where culture plays a huge piece, because obviously, as we know from studying the bioecological model, culture, which is often in the macro system, has a huge impact of how we grow and develop. So there's a really good example in the book of Digo, and I was going to see if I could find it and just read a little part of it for you guys. So, and once again, this is in the book. I don't know if your guys look the same as mine, but it's the picture of the babies right here. Like I said, it will give you the page number, but it might be a little bit different than yours. But let's see. So it talks about Digo, and it talked about in a Digo boy infant demonstrates in what we call an easy temperament, and can lead to a poor adjustment to a mismatch between the boy's temperament and his environment. For example, as an infant, Hamabi was energetic and active and exhibited healthy approaches to tendencies. He was described as one of the most advanced infants in the entire study, so this is all good. However, after starting school, Hamadi began to withdraw, become shy, and show clear signs of distress through acting out behavior. And it says, what caused this transition? The researchers interviewed Hamadi's parents and teachers and were told that Hamadi's temperament did not fit with the cultural expectation of how a boy his age should behave. The efforts of teachers and parents to control his energetic temperament and discourage his curiosity instead of rewarding his enthusiasm and challenging his intellect led Harabi to withdraw and become angry and fearful. So I really like that example because it shows that as a child, what we saw as his temperament, we would have perceived as excellent. But when he grew up and was in school, how he acted wasn't accepted as much by how boys should behave by that culture, and was dismissed, and that made him become withdrawn. So in that sense, the goodness of fit didn't work for him as a child. So it's a really good example. Definitely read up more on that because there's several different examples in there, but that kind of gives you a good idea. So then moving on to identity formation in the adolescent years, this is when we think about identity, once again, these definitions can become a little bit repetitive, but this is the person's self-definition as a separate and distinct individual, including behaviors, beliefs, and attitudes. So I like to think of identity as kind of a reformed personality. So it's not just your personality anymore. It's who you believe you truly are to your core. So it tries to answer the question that's a lot more philosophical, which is, who am I and where do I fit in the context around me? So think back to Erikson's stages of development and how we talked about the identity versus role confusion. This is a great example of that and a great connection back to that. So looking cross-culturally, it's actually very interesting to look at adolescence or the transition to adulthood, because it is often found that there can be more issues, and what I mean by issues is behavioral issues or struggles with the transition for Western cultures, because it almost becomes too complex in nature because we have so many choices. So there's, the choices about what do you want to do with your career? Do you want to go to school? Do you not want to go to school and find a career outside of that? Do you want to get married young? Do you not want to get married young? Do you want to date? There's so many different options in every aspect of life that it almost complicates things more for us, because it's hard to really at that age make these definite decisions that our culture is looking at us to make. As for non-Western societies, it almost can be a little bit easier because the roles and expectations may be more clearly defined. This could make the transition thus much more smoother. And not to say this doesn't happen in Western cultures. I want to make a clear distinction between that, but it is more common in non-Western cultures. So an example of this is in some cultures, let's say the firstborn child is expected to take on the family business. That means from a very young age, this child has the expectation that they're going to be taking over this business, and thus they don't have to think about their options because it's been kind of ingrained with them throughout their whole development. So interesting stuff, and definitely moving forward, we'll talk more about it at the chapters soon to come. So once again, kind of moving forward from that, the transition to adulthood and a time of stability and change. So by the early to mid 20s, we are expected to have a set of stable personality traits. We still are in transition though, right? And we're going to kind of get into emerging adulthood here in a couple weeks, which I think will be really interesting to a lot of you because it's kind of a newer-ish, kind of not anymore, but early 2000s area that there's a lot of research on, and I think it's really appealing for college age groups to study because a lot of us fall in that category, And I won't spend much time here, but there were the big 5 personality traits, and this was a consistent across many ages and cultures that we found either increased as we got older or became an adult. I use that in quotations, or things that became less, like openness to experience. When we become an adult, we become less open to experience. And so finally, I'm just going to note on the aging self, because obviously development does not end when you become an adult. It continues throughout life. And there's a lot of arguments about, with the aging self, how does that impact your own self-identity and how you view yourself, and is that heavily influenced by the negative stereotypes and ageism that especially we have in our culture, the American culture, or is there a positive self-concept and a sense of well-being, and we continue to be productive members of society? Do we continue to develop that personality and identity? And it can go both ways. So there's a really interesting article by Sneed and Whitburn. They talk about it a lot in your book, so I would definitely check that out. But it has to do with, that we still go through identity. We still go through the process of assimilation and accommodation, but with our identity. So we have identity assimilation, identity accommodation, and in the end, identity of balance. And so there is definitely healthy ways to age. That's a very interesting field within itself. So I definitely encourage you all to check that out. So that is it for me. Thank you all for tuning in, and I hope this was helpful and cleared up some of the topics for this week. If you have any questions about any of the content we have gone over for the week, please do give me an email this week, and I would be happy to talk through it with you or answer any questions that you might have. So yeah, thanks again for tuning in, and I'll see you all later. Have a good one.